Hey, fourth graders, Mr. Tracy here. Going to talk about chapter 15 just a little bit before we get into reading chapters 16 and 17. So, yesterday or the day before, you completed chapter 15, and boy, was that a big chapter. I think there was some foreshadowing what was going to happen with Timothy. And I want to talk a little bit about that before we go into chapter 16 and 17. And I look forward to getting a chance to talk to you about chapter 15 and then also the end of the book when you finish the end of the book. So let's take a look at the last page of chapter 15 kind of together here. So I'm going to go ahead and close out my screen here, but wanted to see you guys here today or let you see my face when we started talking about the book, but I might start crying with chapter 15. So I'm going to go ahead and exit that out. And this is the last page. So if you wanted to look at page 112 and read along with me or just look at it on your screen. So this is, there's this big giant storm. Timothy, kind of wraps himself around the tree with Philip and really protects Philip by sacrificing himself. So I'm going to go there to the page. It says, sometime long after dawn, I awakened. And this is Philip talking, right? Because he's telling the story. The rain had stopped. The wind had died down to its usual whisper, but I think the clouds were still covering the sky because I could not feel the sun. I said, Timothy? But he didn't answer me. His hand was cold and stiff in mine. So he's still holding on to Philip all night. Old Timothy of Charlotte Amalie was dead. I stayed there beside him for a long time, very tired, and thinking that he should have taken me with him wherever he had gone. I did not cry then. There were times when you are beyond tears. I went back to sleep, and this time when I awakened, I heard a meow. Then I cried for a long time, holding Stu Cat. Aside from him, I was blind and alone and forgotten on the Cay. So this is a big moment there for the reader. And maybe you saw it coming, maybe you did not, but it still doesn't take that sting away from the relationship that we build with Timothy and Philip and seeing the two of them come together, working together, even though they had their differences. And then to see Timothy sacrifice himself so that Philip can live. And that's where we kind of go to this next chapter, chapter 16 and 17, where we have Philip and Stu Cat, I guess, on this island alone. So let's go ahead and read chapter 16. In the afternoon, I groped west along the hill, 30 or 40 feet from the last palm tree. I began to dig a grave for Timothy. I cleared palm fronds, chunks of sea grape, pieces of wood, dead fish, fan coral, and shells that the sea had thrown up. I marked out a space about 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. Then I dug with my hands. At first, I was angry with Timothy. I said to Stu Cat, why did he leave us alone here? Then as I dug, I had other thoughts. With his great back to the storm, taking its full punishment, he had made it possible for me to live. When my grandfather died, my father said, Philip, sometimes people die from just being very, very tired. I think that's what happened to Timothy. I also think that he had been able to see, had I been able to see, I might have been able to accept it all. But strangely, the darkness separated me from everything. It was as if my blindness were protecting me from fear. I buried Timothy, placing stones at the head of the grave to mark it. I didn't know what to say over the grave. I said, thank you, Timothy. And then I turned my face to the sky. I said, take care of him, God. He was good to me. There didn't seem to be anything else to say, so I just stood by the grave for a while. Then I felt my way back to the spot where our hut had been. I located wood and piled it around the base of the palm tree that held our water keg and the tin box. Both were to the lee side of the storm. It took me a long time to get the keg and the tin box to the ground, but I found, on opening the bung, that the water was still sweet and that the matches wrapped in cellophane inside the tin were dry. But the 2 small bars of chocolate that had been saving for a feast were ruined. I had no taste for them anyway. Feeling it everywhere under my feet, I knew that the cave was littered with debris. I started cleaning the camp area, or what was left of it. I piled all the palm fronds, frayed by the wind, in one place, sticks of wet driftwood in another. With Stu Cat constantly around, I stumbled over him several times. I worked until I felt it was nearing darkness. I'd found one lone coconut in a mass of sea grape and broken sticks. I opened it, ate the meat, offering to share with Stu Cat, who didn't seem interested. Then I made a bed of palm fronds and sprawled out on it, listening to the still angry sea as it tumbled around the damp quay and thinking, I must feed myself and Stu Cat. I must rebuild the hut and build another signal fire down at the East Beach. Then I must spend each day listening for the sound of aircraft. I knew Timothy had already given up on any schooner entering the dangerous Devil's Mouth. I was certain that the sea had washed up Timothy's markers atop the coral reef, and I was also sure that my guide vine rope leading down to the beach had been snapped and tangled by the storm. But now, for the first time, I fully understood why Timothy had so carefully trained me to move around the island and the reef. The reef, I thought. How could I fish without any poles? There must have been washed away. Then I remembered Timothy saying that he would put them in a safe place. The trouble was he'd forgotten to tell me where. I got up and began to run my hands over each palm trunk. On one of them, I touched rope. I followed it around to the lee side with my fingers, and there they were, not 2 or 3, but at least a dozen lashed together, each with a barbed hook and bolt sinker. They were one more part of the legacy Timothy had left me. And this is where we have to kind of wonder, did Timothy kind of know that he might not be on the island forever and that Philip might have to survive on his own? This is kind of a hint, too, that he put all those kind of fishing poles there for Philip to find. The sun came out strong in the morning. I could feel it on my face. It began to dry the island, and toward noon I heard the first cry of a bird. They were returning. By now I had taught myself to tell time, very roughly, simply by turning my head toward the direct warmth of the sun. If the angle was almost overhead, I knew it was around noon. If it was low, then of course it was early morning or late evening. There was so much to do that I hardly knew where to start. Get a campfire going, pile new wood for a single fire, make another rain catchment for the water keg, weave a mat of palm fibers to sleep on, then make a shelter of some kind, fish at the hole in the reef, inspect the palm trees to see if any coconuts were left. I didn't think any could be up there, and search the whole island to discover what the storm had deposited. It was enough work for weeks, and I said to Stu Cat, I don't know how we'll get it all done, but something told me I must stay very busy and not think about myself. I accomplished a lot in 3 days, even putting a new edge on Timothy's knife by honing it on the coral. I jabbed it into the palm of the nearest by my shelter, so I could always know where it was if I needed it. Without Timothy's eyes, I was finding that in my world, everything had to be precise, an exact place for everything. On the 5th day after the storm, I began to scour the island to find out what had been cast up. It was exciting, and I knew it would take days or weeks to accomplish. I had made another cane, and beginning with East Beach, I felt my way back and forth, reaching down to touch everything that my cane struck, sometimes having to spend a long time trying to decide what it was that I held in my hands. I found several large cans and used one of them to start the time again, dropping 5 pebbles into it so that the reckoning would begin again from the night of the storm. I discovered an old broom and a small wooden crate that would make a nice stool. I found a piece of canvas and tried to think of ways to make pants from it, but I had no needle or thread. Other than that, I found many shells, some bodies of dead birds, pieces of cork, and chunks of sponge, but nothing I could really put to good use. It was on the 6th day after the storm, when I was exploring on South Beach, that I heard the birds. Stu Cat was with me. As usual, he growled when they screeched. Their cries were angry, and I guessed that 7 or 8 might be in the air. I stood listening to them, wondering what they were. Then I felt a beat of wings pass my face in an angry cry as the bird dived at me. I lashed out at it with my cane, wondering what they were and why they were attacking me. Another dived down, screaming at me, and his bill nipped the side of my head. For a moment I was confused, not knowing whether to run or cover my eyes with the sea grapes, or what was left of it, or try to fight them off with my cane. There seemed to be a lot of birds. Then one pecked my forehead sharply near my eyes, and I felt blood run down my face. I started to walk back toward camp, but had taken no more than 3 or 4 steps when I tripped over a log. I fell into the sand, and at the same time I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. I heard a raging screech as the bird soared up again. There was another bird that dived at me. I heard Stu Cat snarling and felt him leap up on my back, his claws digging into my flesh. There was another wild screech, and Stu Cat left my back, leaping into the air. His snarls and the wounded screams of a bird filled the stillness over the Cay. I could hear them battling in the sand, and I heard the death caw of the bird. I lay still for a moment. Finally, I crawled to where Stu Cat had his victim. I touched him. His body was rigid and his hair was on edge. He was growling low and muted. Then I touched the bird. It had sounded large, but it was actually rather small. I felt the beak, and it was sharp. Slowly, Stu Cat began to relax. Wondering what had caused the birds to attack me, I felt around in the sand. Soon my hand touched a warm shell. I couldn't blame the birds very much. I'd accidentally walked into their nesting ground. They were fighting for survival after the storm just as I was. I left Stu Cat to his unexpected meal, and I made my way slowly back to camp. Chapter 17. 10 pebbles had gone into my time can when I decided to do something Timothy had told me never to do. I was tired of eating fish and sea grapes, and I wanted to save the few coconuts I'd managed to find in the ground. There were none left in the trees. I wanted scallops or lagonsta to roast over the fire. I didn't dare go off North Beach for scallops because of the sharks, but I thought there might be a lagonsta clinging to a coral at the bottom of the fishing hole. From what Timothy had told me, the sea entrance to the hole was too narrow for a large fish or a shark to swim through. Barracuda, he'd said, could go through, but they were not usually dangerous. If there happened to be an octopus down there, it would have to be a very small one. The big ones were always in the deep water, so he'd said it was safe for him to dive into the hole. I sharpened his stick the way Timothy had done, but I knew that if I felt a lagonsta with my left hand, I would have to be very quick with my right hand, or it would be his tail to push away from me across the sand. With Stu Cat, I went down to the reef and felt my way along it until I found the familiar edges of the hole. I told Stu Cat, if I'm not out in 20 minutes, he'd better jump in and get me. The crazy cat rubbed along my leg and purred. Holding the sharpened stick in my right hand, I slipped into the warm water, treading for a moment, waiting to see if anything came up. Then I ducked my head underwater, swam down a few feet, and came up again. I was certain that nothing was in the hole aside from the usual small fish I yanked out in the morning. After a few minutes, I had my courage up and dived to the bottom, holding the sharp stick in my left hand now, and using my right hand to feel the coral in the rocks. Coming up now and again from the air, I slowly felt my way around the bottom of the small pool, touching sea fans, and waved back and forth, feeling the organ pipe coral and the bigger chunks of brain coral. Several times, I was startled when seaweed or sea fans would brush against my face and swam quickly to the surface. It must have taken me nearly 30 minutes to decide that I could hunt lagonsta in the hole. This time I dived in earnest. I went straight down, touched the bottom, and then took a few strokes toward the coral sides of the pool. Timothy said lagonsta were always on the bottom and usually over against the rocks in the coral. To my amazement, I touched one on my first sweep. I drove the sharp stick into him, swimming quickly to the surface. Panting, I shouted to Stu Cat, "Lobster tonight!" I swam to the edge, pushed the lagonsta off the stick, caught my breath again, and dived. I dived many times again without touching the hard shell that meant lagonsta. I began sticking my hands deeper into the shelves and over the ledges near the bottom. I rested a few minutes, then decided I'd make one more dive. I was happy with the lobster that was now on the reef, But it was quite small, barely a meal for Stew Cat and myself. I dived again and this time found what seemed to be an opening into the deep hole, or at least the hole went far back. There was a big lobster in there, I thought. Up I came again, filled my lungs, and I dived immediately. I ran my hand back into that hole, and something grabbed it. Terrified, I put my feet against the rocks to pull away. The pain was severe. Whatever had my wrist had the strength of Timothy's arms. I jerked hard. Whatever it was came out with my arm, its tail smashing against my chest. I kicked and rose to the surface. The thing was still on my wrist, its teeth sunk in deep. I'm sure I screamed as I broke the water, flailing towards the edge of the hole. Then the thing let loose, and I managed to get it up and over the side and out of the hole. Pain shooting my entire arm, I lay panting on the edge of the pool, gingerly began to feel my wrist. It was bleeding, but not that badly. But the teeth had sunk in deep. It wasn't a fish, because the body felt long and narrow. Sometime later, I made an informed guess that whatever it had been was a large moray eel. Whatever it was, I never went back into the water again. So that's the end of chapters 16 and 17. We are so close to finishing the book. Thanks for listening along. Good luck finishing the questions in the packet, and so excited to talk to you about the end of the book. Take care, everybody.